This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. To pre-order Aetherdrift, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and in this video I'm continuing with my Aetherdrift set review. I've already taken a look at all the multicolored and colorless cards, and in this video we'll look at the white cards. Over the next week or so, I'll be evaluating every single card in the format to get you ready for your pre-release and the release of the set on Magic Arena. For each of these cards, I'll discuss how I think they'll perform in Limited, that means Draft and Sealed, and I'll punctuate each evaluation with the letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews and unsure of what my letter grades mean, you can find a guide in the description. There are a few important things to keep in mind as I review these cards. First, because we're only talking about Draft and Sealed, I'm only going to be looking at cards that can be found in play boosters. Second, these are my evaluations of these cards before it's possible to play Aetherdrift Limited, since my goal is to have this review done in time for the pre-release, and that means I'll be wrong about some stuff, but as the format comes into focus, I'll be doing videos where I discuss how things have turned out. Lastly, I want to let you know that there are some set review related perks for being a channel member or a patron. You get access to my ongoing set notes during preview season, and you'll also get a spreadsheet with all of my grades once the set review is complete. If those perks interest you, check out the description where you can find out how to support the channel using one of those methods. Alright, without further ado, let's dive in with a look at the white cards in Aetherdrift. First up, it's Air Response Unit, which for 2 generic and a white is a 3/3 artifact vehicle at uncommon with flying, vigilance, and crew 1. So if this were a 3 mana 3/3 with flying and vigilance straight up, it'd be a B- or even a B. Obviously, it's not that since you need crew 1, but crew 1 is really the sweet spot for vehicles. It's very easy to get done, and there are various vehicle and artifact synergies in the set that make a card like this better than it would be in a normal set. But, you know, it is still a conditional creature, and needing that condition for this to actually be relevant on the board does matter. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Alacrian Armory, which for 3 generic and a white is an uncommon artifact. Creatures you control get +0 and +1 and have vigilance. At the beginning of combat on your turn, choose up to 1 target mount or vehicle you control. Until end of turn, that permanent becomes saddled if it's a mount, and becomes an artifact creature if it's a vehicle. So the buff on this alone, not worth 4 mana, not even close. But the combat trigger is interesting. Getting 1 free crew or saddle per turn can be powerful, but even in a set like this one, you're not always going to have something to target. This probably needs a build-around grade, because you'll need a critical mass of vehicles and mounts before you can ever play this, and that's doable, but some decks will have like 2 or 3 vehicles and mounts, in which case this is not very good. It's probably a D at the best in that style of deck, and I think it has a ceiling of a C+. It does seem like it can work in the right deck, but not all white decks are going to be the right deck. Next up, it's Basri, Tomorrow's Champion, which for 1 white is a 2/1 legendary human knight at rare. You can pay 1 white and tap it and exert Basri, which means he doesn't untap during your next untap step, and you create a 1/1 white cat creature token with lifelink. He's got cycling for 2 generic and a white, and when you cycle him, cats you control gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. This is a great 1-drop. It can do Savannah Alliance stuff when you need it to, but once it can no longer attack, you can just start exerting it to get a nice token every other turn. While the format doesn't have an overwhelming cat theme, it certainly doesn't hurt that you can cycle this away when you don't need it and occasionally get some extra value out of doing so. This is just so cheap and relevant all game long, and I think that makes it a B+. Next up, it's Brightfield Glider, which for 1 white mana is a 1/1 possum mount at common. It's got vigilance. When it attacks while saddled, it gets +1/+2 and gains flying until end of turn, and it has saddle 3. A 1 mana 1/1 vigilance is super underwhelming. It doesn't really matter that it doesn't have to tap to attack because it's pretty bad at attacking and blocking. The saddle part is nice, and there are more ways to saddle 3 in this format than in most, but it sort of feels like this is underwhelming early and underwhelming in the mid to late game too. I think it's a C-. Next up, it's Brightfield Mustang, which for 3 generic and a white is a 3/3 horse mount at common. When it attacks while saddled, untap it and put a +1/+1 counter on it, and it has saddle 1. Starting out as a hill giant is rough in today's limited formats, but saddling this is really easy, so it will often be growing and untapping itself when it does attack. Still, even as a 4/4, it's not going to consistently have a good attack when it rumbles for the first time on turn 5. I think this is a C-. Next up, it's Broadcast Rambler, which for 4 generic and a white is a 5/4 vehicle at common. When it enters, you create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying, and it has crew 1. This looks pretty solid. It's very easy to crew, and even make something that can crew it and of course it adds a nice flying token to the board up front, not to mention 2 artifacts in a format where that definitely matters. I'm giving this a C. At number 7, it's Bulwark Ox, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 Ox mount at rare. When it attacks while saddled, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Sacrifice this creature. Creatures you control with counters on them gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn, and it has saddle 1. This is not a card you want to see your opponent play on turn 2. It can quickly augment the board, including itself, which makes it a lot more likely that it will be able to attack successfully on the turn after it comes down. And you can put the counters elsewhere too when that's more relevant. And there are enough counters in this set, especially in green-white, that this activated ability is going to come up even outside of the Bulwark Ox's own ability. So this is just really efficient and can take over games when it comes down on turn 2 and maintains utility all game long, really, giving it a B+. Next up, it's Canyon Vaulter, which for 1 generic and a white is a 3/1 core pilot and uncommon. When it saddles a mount or crews a vehicle during your main phase, that mount or vehicle gains flying until end of turn. Vehicles usually hit pretty hard, so sending them into the air definitely matters, and a 2-mana 3/1 is likely to play better in this format than in most because of crew and saddle. Keep in mind it does say during your main phase, so you can't use a vehicle to block a flyer or something on your opponent's turn. Still pretty good though, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Cloud Spire Captain, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/3 human pilot and uncommon. Mounts and vehicles you control get +1/+1, and this creature saddles mounts and crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater. This is going to buff a lot of stuff in white, and the fact that it helps you crew and saddle those same things that it buffs is great. It'll impact the board when it comes down often enough for me to be pretty interested in this. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Collision Course, which for 1 generic and a white is a common sorcery. Choose one. Collision Course deals X damage to target creature, where X is the number of permanents you control that are creatures and or vehicles, or destroy target artifact. This is a format where destroy target artifact cards are going to be main deckable, and that would probably be like a C if that's the only mode this had, maybe a C- because it's a sorcery, but you're going to have a target often enough. The second mode is going to be less good in most situations, but it does mean this can remove other stuff, provided you have the requisite vehicles and or creatures in play. I'm starting this at a C+, and I can see a world where it's even better. Next up, it's Daring Mechanic, who for 2 generic and a white is a 3/3 human artificer at common, and you can pay 3 generic and a white to put a +1/+1 counter on target mount or vehicle. The solid stat line means you feel fine dropping this on 3, and in the mid to late game, those counters can be pretty good, giving this a C. Next up, it's Detention Chariot, which for 4 generic and 2 white is a 6/6 artifact vehicle at uncommon. When it enters, exile target artifact or vehicle an opponent controls until this vehicle leaves the battlefield. It has crew 3, and you can cycle it for 1 white. So this is expensive, but removing your opponent's best artifact or creature while adding a big ol' 6/6 vehicle to the board is pretty good. And if you have this early, you can cycle it away, and white does have ways to reanimate it or get it back from the graveyard. Attacking with it will sometimes be risky, but this still looks really strong. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Gallant Strike, which for 1 generic and a white is an uncommon instant. It says destroy target creature with toughness 4 or greater, and it has cycling for 2 generic. This kind of removal is always decently playable, but it's a bummer when you don't have a target. Adding cycling helps alleviate that bummer in a big way, since you still have access to a powerful conditional removal spell that almost always trades up, and you can just throw it away when it doesn't have a target. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Glory Heath Lynx, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/3 cat-mounted uncommon. It has lifelink. When it attacks while saddled, you search your library for a basic plains card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle, and it has saddle 2. A 2-mana 2/3 with lifelink is something you play 100% of the time in Limited, so add in the fact that Mount is a relevant creature type in the format, and this can grab you a plains from time to time, and we're talking about a great 2-drop. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Guardian Sunmare, which for 3 generic and 2 white is a 5/5 horse mount at rare. It's got Ward 2, and when it attacks while saddled, you search your library for a non-land permanent card with mana value 3 or less, put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle, and it has saddle 4. A 5-mana 5/5 with Ward 2 is pretty solid. A creature that big with Ward is going to be difficult for your opponent to kill without at least spending a comparable amount of mana, so you're never really going to feel like you get blown out, even in the worst case. And sometimes word 2 just means they can't kill it, and if they can't kill it and you can saddle it on the next turn, things are going to go south for your opponent in a hurry because you get a very nice 2-for-1. Getting your best mana value 3 non-land permanent right on the battlefield is just a huge deal. If your opponent can't take down the Sunmare after that saddled attack by like double blocking or something, the game is going to quickly get out of reach. So it puts them in a lot of horrible situations, basically. The bad news is Saddle 4 is a lot and far from automatic, but this does still look really strong. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Guidelight Synergist, which for 3 generic and a white is a 0/4 artifact creature, robot artificer at uncommon. It's got flying, and it gets +1/+0 for each artifact you control. So the floor is a 4 mana 1/4 with flying, and there are enough artifacts around for this to have more power than that, especially in white. It seems solid enough. I'm giving it a C. Next, it's Interface Ace, which for 1 generic and a white is a 0/4 artifact creature robot pilot at common. This creature saddles, mounts, and crews vehicles using its toughness rather than its power. And whenever it becomes tapped during your turn, untap it. This ability triggers only once each turn. So this can crew almost any vehicle or mount in the set, which is pretty nice for a 2-drop, and it can even do it twice per turn, so it's pretty good at crewing and mounting, but pretty terrible at everything else. Even in a vehicle set, I'm not thinking this always makes the cut. Like, you'd rather have cards that are good at crewing, but can also attack and block reasonably well on their own, and this just isn't that. I'm giving it a D+. Next, it's Leonin Surveyor, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 cat scout at common with Start Your Engines. During your turn, this creature has First Strike, and it has max speed, 3 generic, exile it from your graveyard, draw a card. This is tough to block in the early game, which is pretty good when you've also started your engines, and it's great you can usually cash it in for a card in the later stages of the game. Looks like a pretty nice common, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Light Shield Parry, which for 1 white mana is a common instant. Target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn, and it has cycling for 2 generic. So without cycling, this would be like a C- level trick. It's nice that it's cheap, but it doesn't make a creature win combat or dodge removal quite often enough to be like a trick you play the first copy of in all your aggro decks. But the good news here is that you can cycle it away when it's not that good. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Light Wheel Enhancements, which for 1 white mana is a common enchantment aura with enchant creature or vehicle. It has Start Your Engines, which means if you have no speed, it starts at 1. It increases once in each of your turns when an opponent loses life. Max speed is 4, so this is something you start to track as soon as you play something that has Start Your Engines, and then you track it for the rest of the game. Most cards with Start Your Engines also have max speed, which means when you get to speed 4, you get some extra effect. In this case, you can cast this from your graveyard, and it also gives enchanted permanent +1/+1 and vigilance. So this is a really cheap aura, and one that you're reasonably likely to be able to cast out of the graveyard in the mid to late game. The buff it offers isn't amazing, but once you get to max speed, it becomes a pretty big problem for your opponent. And the fact that it buffs your creature oftentimes will give you an attack that helps you get to like max speed 2 the turn you play it. Still, I find it hard to go above a C- here. There'll just be too many games where you aren't able to get it back. Next up, it's Lotus Guard Disciple, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/2 bird cleric at common. It's got flying, and when it enters, target creature or vehicle gains lifelink and indestructible until end of turn. Windrake definitely isn't what it used to be, but if you give Windrake a really good interest trigger like this one, it's still a pretty good card. It'll almost always give you a good attack and gain you some life. That helps make up for the below rate stat line for sure. This is a good common. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Nesting Bot, which for 1 white mana is a 1 mana 1/1 artifact creature robot at uncommon. It has Start Your Engines. When it dies, you make a 1/1 colorless servo, and it has max speed. This creature gets +1/+0. Anytime we see a 1 mana 1/1 that makes a 1/1 when it dies, and it ends up being solid or better in limited, and white-black especially has ways to sacrifice this for value. This also helps you get speed started on turn 1 while adding a real thing to the board, which is great in a format where it seems like getting max speed is a big deal. And while its own buff for achieving that is underwhelming, it does make your other speed cards better. This just looks like it does a ton for 1 mana. I think I want to start it at a B-. Next up, it's Perilous Snare, which for 2 generic and a white is a rare artifact with Start Your Engines. When it enters, you exile target non-land permanent opponent controls until this artifact leaves the battlefield, and once you have max speed, you can tap it and put a +1/+1 counter on a creature or vehicle you control. Activate only as a sorcery. So this starts out as Artifact Oblivion Ring. That's like a great starting point and a card you always play. And once you have max speed, it becomes a really good way to put counters on your stuff for free. So this starts out as premium removal, and premium removal that is likely to help you raise your speed because you're often going to be getting a blocker out of the way or whatever. And then it has this very real effect that can just take over the game. Like getting a free counter every turn, we've seen numerous times at this point, can really swing a game in your favor. I think that makes this removal spell into a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Pride of the Road, which for 3 generic and a white is a 2/5 zombie cat warrior at uncommon. It's got vigilance and start your engines. And when you have max speed, at the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature or vehicle you control gains double strike until end of turn. A 4-mana 2/5 with vigilance isn't completely terrible. It's the kind of card that can threaten to raise your speed on many turns, while also making it hard for your opponent to pull it off, which I think is relevant in this format. Once you have max speed, it can turn almost any creature into a big threat too. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Ride's End, which for 4 generic and a white is a common instant that costs 3 less to cast if it targets a tapped permanent, and it exiles a creature or vehicle. This will feel pretty good when you can pay 2, and clunky as heck the rest of the time. This makes it kind of bad for aggressive decks, since you usually want to have ways to efficiently get rid of blockers, and this doesn't do it. It'll be better in slower decks, but I think overall that makes this a C. Next up, it's Roadside Assistance, which for 2 generic and a white is an uncommon enchantment aura with enchant creature or vehicle. When this aura enters, create a 1/1 colorless pilot creature token with this token saddles, mounts, and crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater, and enchanted permanent gets +1/+1 and has lifelink. +1/+1 in lifelink is a nice boost that can turn a race on its head, but it also generally needs a decent creature for it to really feel worth it. The good news is this format has tons of vehicles, which have fairly formidable stats, and the pilot this gives you can crew most vehicles, so putting this on a vehicle isn't as bad as it might seem. That just seems like a pretty powerful play pattern, actually, and it also works nicely on plenty of creatures too, especially evasive ones, and then the fact you get a token helps you avert a 2-for-1 disaster to a certain extent. The risk is still there if you're not careful, but generally you're going to get something out of this card, even if your opponent manages to kill the thing you enchanted, at least after it's resolved. I'm a little tempted to give this like a B- just because it seems like it does so much, but the fact that it's an aura and that enchantments don't really matter in this set does make me temper my expectations a little bit. I'm starting it at a C+. Next up, it's Salvation Engine, which for 4 generic and a white is a 6/10 artifact vehicle at Mythic Rare. Other artifact creatures you control get +2/+2. Whenever this vehicle attacks, return up to 1 target artifact card from your graveyard to the battlefield, and it is crew 6. It's great that this will offer a buff even when it's not crewed, and that's important because a 5-mana 6/10 vehicle with crew 6 needs to be doing something right away, otherwise you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And typically this will impact the board somewhat when it comes down, and sometimes in a really big way if you have enough artifact creatures. Generally in white you're going to have a few, or at least you're going to have vehicles that are now bigger and can protect you better, or attack better. Crewing it's not easy, but it's also not impossible in a format where you have a bunch of creatures who are really geared towards being able to crew this. Like, you can pull it off with just a couple of those tokens, which are relatively plentiful in the set. And once you do attack with this, things really get out of hand because you bring back an artifact, it's probably a vehicle or an artifact creature, and it's going to be bigger. And the fact it's a 6/10 means it's not that easy to take down in combat either without giving up something significant. I do think the fact that it's crew 6 and that while this format likes artifacts, it's not like artifact creatures are everywhere. I think those things keep it from being a straight up bomb, but I wouldn't be shocked if it ends up there. I'm starting it at a B+ though. Next up, it's Sky Seer's Chariot, which for 1 generic and a white is a 3/3 vehicle at rare. It's got flying. When it enters, you choose a non-land card name. Activated abilities of sources with the chosen name cost 2 generic more to activate, and it has crew 2. So it can be tough to name a card that will be affected by this, but it's obviously not impossible, since if they have something in play already that has an activated ability, you're just going to name it. And crew is an activated ability. So, you know, just name your opponent's best vehicle, and you're likely to get at least some effect out of this. Making them pay mana to crew their vehicles is pretty brutal. Obviously, it gets better in like game 2 and 3, where you can play it even when they don't have something for you to name, and you can make a much better attempt at naming something that might actually end up in play. And then on top of that, like, if this was just a 2-mana 3/3 vehicle with flying and crew 2, like, that would be an okay card in this set where there are enough payoffs for having artifacts and vehicles and stuff around, and it's reasonably efficient. So like, this definitely isn't amazing and limited because you're just not always going to be able to name something that matters. And then even when you can name something that matters, if it's late enough in the game, it actually doesn't matter. So you are leaning a lot on how good this is as an actual vehicle. And the good news is it's pretty good and it has some upside. I think it's a C+. Next up, it's Spectacular Pile Up, which for 3 generic and 2 white is a rare sorcery. All creatures and vehicles lose indestructible until end of turn, then destroy all creatures and vehicles, and it has cycling for 2 generic. Sweepers are strong, and there are a few cards that can impact the game in the same way a sweeper can, but they can also be super awkward. Since they're symmetrical, and you almost always give your opponent a chance to rebuild before you can, that's why it's nice to add cycling to a card like this, since sometimes just adding another creature to the board is more beneficial than blowing up everything. Like if you're slightly ahead or at parity, wrathing usually isn't that good. If you're behind, it's great. And so you still have the upside of drawing this when you are behind and just blowing everything up without as much downside of it being just like a straight up dead card or close to dead card in your hand in the other 2 common situations in a game of limited Magic. Furthermore, the fact that this hits vehicles is nice because most sweepers don't, because usually vehicles aren't creatures during your turn and this is a sorcery. But this will make sure they all blow up too, which is good. Overall, this does look really strong to me. I'm always hesitant to give a sweeper a bomb grade because of the reasons I just mentioned. Like, yeah, there are games where this is going to feel like an A+, but especially if it didn't have cycling, there are also games where it's like a D. So overall, I think this is pretty good, but it is short of a bomb. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Spot Cycle Scouter, which for 1 generic and a white is a 3/2 vehicle at common. When it enters, you scry 2, and it has crew 1. So without Scry 2, I wouldn't be that interested in this, even in a vehicle set. It's underwhelming for a 2-mana vehicle, even with crew 1, but Scry 2 makes a big difference. It really improves your draws in a big way, no matter when you get it. Like if you get this on 2 and you have too many lands, or you don't have enough lands, it helps you with that. And then if you get it late, you can use it to make sure your next few draws, which are usually crucial when both players are in top deck mode, are better than they'd otherwise be. So that is a very real enters trigger, and then you get an okay-ish vehicle, so I think it's a C. Next up, it's Sundial Dawn Tyrant, which for 1 generic and a white is a 3/3 legendary artifact creature construct at uncommon. This is way easier to cast than most 2-mana 3/3s that we see, so playing this on turn 2 is really doable, and the stat line is nice, which means he's also good at crewing, and he comes with very useful artifact typing. So even though it's technically vanilla, this has like a pretty solid baseline and some legit upside in the format. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Swift Wing Assailant, which for 3 generic and a white is a 3/3 bird warrior at common with flying and start your engines, and it has max speed, it gets +0/+1, and has vigilance. 4-mana 3/3 flyers have underwhelmed as of late, problem being that they aren't very good against a lot of 2-mana removal or 2-mana 3/1s, and those are all over the place these days. I feel like a vanilla 4-mana 3/3 flyer is a C- at the very best, and while this is more than vanilla, it's not by a wide enough margin that I'm not excited about it. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Tune Up, which for 3 generic and a white is an uncommon sorcery. Return target artifact card from your graveyard to the battlefield. If it's a vehicle, it becomes an artifact creature. Notably, this does permanently make a vehicle into a creature. It's not just an until end of turn thing. In many formats, this would just be a straight up F, right? But they gave us enough strong vehicles with cycling, along with the usual random graveyard stuff that any set has, that I think this will actually be viable in white. It still takes some setup and will be a dead card sometimes, so it's still not like great, but it's not the F it would be in most sets. I think it's a C-. Next up, it's Unswerving Sloth, which for 3 generic and a white is a 5/5 sloth mounted uncommon. When it attacks while saddled, it gains indestructible until end of turn. Untap all creatures you control, saddle 4. So this is effectively a free attack when you can saddle it, both because it becomes indestructible and it untaps all your stuff. So that includes itself, that includes the things that saddled it. And sending a 5/5 at your opponent and not really paying anything for it, when it's indestructible especially, is a pretty sweet effect. It also means you're not really giving up anything on defense if you're in like a close race. You just get to send this thing in and then still be in just as good of a defensive position once it's your opponent's turn. I mean, it is true that this is fairly one-dimensional, like it's just really good at attacking and pretty good at blocking, but those are important things. You know, it doesn't have an enters trigger that seems insane or anything, but this saddle trigger is really, really strong for all the reasons I've already mentioned, and I think that makes this quite good. giving it a B. Next up, it's Valor's Flagship, which for 4 generic and 3 white is a 7/7 legendary artifact vehicle at Mythic Rare. It's got flying, first strike, and lifelink. It has crew 3, and it has cycling for X, 2 generic, and a white, and when you cycle it, you create X 1/1 pilot creature tokens. This is sort of like Decree of Justice, which is pretty fun, and cycling this can be pretty nasty, as you can make a bunch of tokens at instant speed. You know, sometimes you just need like 3 more damage to kill your opponent, and you can cycle this at the end of their turn and make 3 pilots. Suddenly you have lethal on your turn before you get to 7 mana, right? Obviously, if you get to 7 mana, it's usually going to be better to play the Flagship than it is to cycle it, because it's just this insane creature. And even if you have to like give up everything on defense to crew it and attack with it, which you probably won't, but if you have to, because you have to tap your creatures to crew it, it's not that big of a deal, because it's going to smash in for 7 and gain you 7 life, which is usually going to be enough to make up for any sort of position it puts you in. And obviously it can quickly end the game in the air. So yeah, it's expensive, but the cycling part gives you a bunch of flexibility, and then even putting it in the graveyard, you can probably get it back later one way or another, because white is a little bit graveyard oriented in this set. So this just looks like a straight up bomb to me, giving it an A. And our last card is Voyager Glidecar, which for 1 white mana is a rare artifact vehicle. When it enters, you scry 1, and you can tap 3 other untapped creatures you control, and until end of turn, this vehicle becomes an artifact creature and gains flying. Put a +1/+1 counter on it, and it has crew 1. A 1 mana 2/3 vehicle with crew 1 that scries 1 when it enters is probably something you always play in this format. You know, it wouldn't be an exciting card, but it's a pretty good 1-drop that you're likely to be able to attack with on turn 2 by playing just about any creature, and you're probably going to have a 2-drop thanks to the scry. And then later in the game, you can start tapping your extra creatures that you have around and sending this into the air and growing it. Keep in mind, you can do it at instant speed, so it's the kind of effect where you can wait until the end of your opponent's turn and then tap a bunch of creatures for this effect. Sure, the fact that it becomes an artifact creature until end of turn doesn't matter, but putting the counters on it does. So yeah, I mean, this just seems like a 1-drop that is quite good on turn 1, but then stays relevant all game long, and even when you get it late, it's still going to be pretty good. I'm giving this a B+. And our last white card, for real this time, is Voyager Quick Wielder, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/4 artifact creature robot artificer at common, and artifact spells you cast cost 1 generic less to cast. So this is a pretty solid stat line, and reducing the cost of artifacts in a color that really cares about them definitely matters, even if that kind of ability becomes less relevant the longer the game goes on. I'm giving this a C+. So those are all the white cards in Aetherdrift. In the next video, we'll take a look at all the blue ones. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on the set review videos that are already out there, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.